It's 6 books, actually. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a kind of a mid-month wrap-up of the books that I've read so far in March. I've read 6 books, but I can only talk about 5 because one of the books is a book I read for the BookTube prize, so I'll be leaving that one out and just talking about 5 books. So this video, unlike lots of my videos, is strictly speaking about books that I've read so far. So the first book I read this month was Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. And this is a kind of an interesting book which deals a lot with the science of taxonomy and how we assign things meaning by the categories we group them in. And Miller goes beyond this kind of idea of grouping things in taxonomy to how we find the things in our own lives that give our lives meaning. And it's kind of an interesting kind of connection between a taxonomist, a really notable kind of academic in American history whose name I think is David Starr Jordan. Is that his name? Sorry, I kind of forgotten and I can't read my handwriting. But Jordan was, a young scientist. He was a go-getter. He was self-made. He ended up being the first president of Princeton, and so you'd think he's this really impressive person, and he's really obsessed with the taxonomy of fish. That was his thing, was discovering new species of fish and then classifying them all into different families. And on 2 separate occasions, once by fire and I believe once just by collapse, his collection was destroyed, and he kind of perseveres and he goes on through. So you think, wow, this Jordan fellow is a really admirable person. And in the beginning, it appears as though Lulu Miller does really admire him. And there's certainly things to admire about Jordan, but there are also a lot of things not to admire about Jordan, which come out later as the book goes on. And Miller kind of makes this parallel, I think, between Jordan and her father, who was himself a scientist, and essentially told her that, she meant nothing, that life meant nothing, that no one meant anything, and that actually, worms, which perform an important function for, soil aeration, were more important than she was, which would probably give you kind of a low self-esteem. And we learn more about her father, we learn more about her family when she was growing up, and so we kind of have this kind of combination of this story about Jordan and this kind of memoir about Miller. And as the book goes on, we learn all these negative things about Jordan, and we learn more about Miller's struggle to find meaning and to find a place for herself in the world, which, spoiler alert, she does. And that kind of leads to the writing of this book. I will be honest with you, there were times I thought this book was a bit much, maybe a little too woo-woo here and there, maybe a little bit too much of a leap between what Miller was going through and this connection between her dad and David Starr Jordan. It's a pleasant book, it's an informative book. I really thought that there was probably a little bit too much about David Starr Jordan in the book and about fish taxonomy, and to get to the point where she explains the title and how that relates to her life. I don't give book stars. This is kind of a meh book for me. I think for a lot of people it would be a really good book, but for me it's kind of just in that kind of meh territory. By the way, this is a book that's nominated by the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, and that's one of the reasons I picked it up, and I could find it easily in my library. A second book on the Women's Prize for Nonfiction list that I was able to get from my library is By the Fire We Carry by Rebecca Nagle. This is essentially the story of how the Muskogee people and the Cherokee people and other groups who were forcibly relocated in a genocidal move from the eastern United States, west of Mississippi, into Oklahoma, which was at the time called the Indian Territories, how those people regained control to a certain extent of their land as a result of a Supreme Court ruling in a 1990s murder case, which is a fairly complex and involved story. And so what Nagle does in the book is she goes from the past, kind of concentrating on did I say Cheyenne? I meant Cherokee. Kind of concentrating on the Cherokee people, the Muskogee people, and how they were treated by the United States government, forcibly removed, the Trail of Tears, that kind of genocidal long march that we forcibly sent Indigenous Americans on to get to Oklahoma, the role that her ancestors played in having that come about. Nagle is an enrolled member of the Cherokee tribe. and how that all came about. And then, so there's these kind of historical topics she covers, and then there's the story of this really brutal murder which took place in Oklahoma, and the trial of the man who was found guilty and his appeal. And essentially the appeal came down to the fact that his lawyers are going to argue that the state of Oklahoma didn't have the right to prosecute him because he committed the crime on land that belonged to the Muskogee people as a part of their reservation. And this leads to a really prolonged case involving this man, but really kind of focusing on whether or not the reservations that have been created for the 5 tribes that were forcibly relocated in the Trail of Tears episode in American history, whether or not their reservation still existed. Because if it did, that meant that these people, these indigenous groups, would collectively control something like, I don't know, 2/5, a third or more of the state of Oklahoma, including some major cities and all kinds of resources. And eventually how that case worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made what, if you know anything about our Supreme Court under Trump, a surprising decision. And so, I found the book to be really interesting, and I watched Gemma's video. She reviewed this book on her channel today, and she talked about how, essentially she felt like if she had a better background in Indigenous American history, the book would have worked more for her and been more accessible to her, and I think that's true. This is kind of an area, a topic that I have an interest in. I've done some reading in before. As an American, I know a lot about the history of the way in which the United States government treated indigenous people. By the way, a history which, Trump is busily trying to erase so that white people only come out as heroes in American history. But I know a lot about this, or some about this. So a lot of the history was something that was familiar to me. It is pretty dense in terms of case law and property law, which can be kind of slow going in some places. But I think Nagle does a pretty good job of putting all that together in what is on the whole, I think, an entertaining and really informative work of nonfiction. And I liked it, and I thought it was good. I don't think it's great, but I do think it was good. So those are the 2 books I've read so far, or finished so far, for the Women's Prize for nonfiction. The book I can't tell you I read, I also read as a part of reading the Women's Prize for fiction. So I can't tell you about that one, but the one I can tell you about is probably, I think, one of the most talked about books on BookTube as a result of being on that prize list. I believe it also was nominated for the Carol Shields Prize recently, and that's All Fours by Miranda July. So I'm probably not telling you anything when I tell you that the story involves a middle-aged woman who has a child and who is married and who lives in California, and she's some kind of an artist. Now, it turns out that she's a writer, which kind of brings it into parallel perhaps with Miranda July's own experiences. But she's at that point in her life where, it doesn't seem to be a lot of passion. She's had some success as an artist. She's kind of a minor celebrity artist, I think is how she's described. And she's essentially kind of unhappy, kind of bored, kind of unhappy, kind of looking for the next thing. And she decides she's going to take a cross-country drive from California, from Los Angeles, all the way to New York City, where she's going to treat herself to a week of staying in a fancy hotel and going to art museums and seeing her friends in New York. And that's what she's going to do. Her husband, who is I believe, a promoter of musical acts, I think that's what he is, or something like that. Maybe he's an agent, is all for this. He helps her plan out the trip. She explains it to her young child that she's going to go, and she gets in her car and she sets out to go. And she gets about 20 miles away from home, and she stops in a small community, and she checks herself into a hotel, and she becomes involved in the life of this community. And particularly, she gets involved with a young man in this community who she meets at a gas station. And they get involved in a relationship which really is never quite, strictly speaking, a sexual relationship. But she's gone this whole time, and she's just in this hotel. These aren't spoilers, I don't think. I think everybody who's reviewed the book has gone that far. And a lot of times what I found in this book is that's kind of where people, because they don't want to give away spoilers, that's where a lot of discussion of the book stops. And I think if you just went to that point, and you just heard me describe the book in that way, that the book sounds like A, probably something you've read before, B, not very interesting. It probably sounds like the main character is not very likable, and I have to be honest with you, I don't think she is very likable. I think I would describe her as a charming narcissist, perhaps. And then the book becomes a far deeper kind of exploration of how women, perhaps some women, deal with, or that's not the right way to put it, but of how perimenopause affects women, because she is in that phase, and she becomes convinced that essentially her life is over. Her sexual desire is about to drop off the table, and her life in that way is over, and she'll just become this kind of sexless, desireless drudge in a few years. And so she essentially decides, in kind of a midlife crisis moment, to try to cram everything into these last few good years she has. And that means she behaves selfishly. She does things which seem completely out of whack with sanity and normalcy. And I'm not suggesting that, Miranda July says this is what all women on perimenopause do, or are in perimenopause, or approaching perimenopause do, or should do. She's giving us, I think, an extreme example of how this affects this one woman who, I don't know, might be based on Miranda July for all I know, and kind of the way in which this misinformation about perimenopause kind of leads to some of these problems. I would just say there's not a lot of change that goes on with this character, but you do, I think, learn a lot about Miranda July as a writer, her ability, I think, relatively brave ability to create this character who's unlikable and does unlikable things, and yet for me come out and still feel like this was a very good reading experience, that this is a very good book, that this character is someone I'm going to be thinking about and someone I'll have memories of for a really long period of time. And I think the book is really good. Do I think it's necessarily a great book? I'm still working on that, because oftentimes with books that are particularly about subjects that I can't personally have any firsthand experience with, I'm not sure I get all the things, and when that's true, it usually takes me some time to work out whether or not I think what I think about the book, and that's kind of where I still am. But I do think it's a very good book. The fourth book I read this month that I can tell you about is Mistakes Meet Murder by Charles Heathcote. BookTube, AuthorTube's very own Charles Heathcote, has written a second mystery novel in the Cozy Mystery series, focusing on the kind of amateur detective, I'm not sure that's entirely fair, Alice Valentine, and the retired policeman who helps her, whose name is Marmaduke Featherstone, just incredibly great name. And there is another murder in their community. If you've read Charlie's books, he wrote a series of books about Doris that are set in a specific place, and these books are kind of set in the same way, in the same place, and they're adjacent characters, but this is really different. The first one of these books is An Heir to Murder, which follows Alice after she inherits a piece of property and her life. And Alice Valentine is just an incredibly great character. She drinks too much, she oftentimes, and she gets really angry. She's kind of a volatile personality. She says a whole lot of funny things, and she kind of works her way through herself and kind of a personal growth thing, and at the same time she's cleverly, along with Marmaduke, solving these crimes. And oftentimes there's more than one thing going on. And since this is a murder mystery, I'm not going to tell you much more than that, except this book involves three older women, who all have the exact same name. And how Charlie puts all that together and makes all that work, I think, is remarkable. And one of my favorite things about the book is the ending seems to indicate to me there should be at least one more book in the series. I think Charlie's writing is charming. I think his dialogue is awesome. I think his dialogue is great. I think his characters are memorable and lovable, and I'm really interested to see what happens with Alice's mother, who is a kind of an overbearing figure in the first two books as we move forward. But anyway, just a really enjoyable, cozy mystery, and I'm going to do my part here to promote Charlie's book, because I think it's well worth reading, and I think since this is March, and March Mystery Madness takes place in March, this is a good book for you to pick up. I think you will thoroughly enjoy it. And then the last book I read this month was an audiobook of a book called That Librarian by Amanda Jones, and Amanda Jones is that librarian that the title refers to. This is essentially a memoir of the time in which, or a time period in Amanda Jones's life in which she became the focus of a lot of hatred of book banners in her home state of Louisiana. Jones is a nationally recognized school librarian who'd won awards and given speeches, and she finds out that, you know, the book banners, who we all associate with probably Florida more now than other states, these book banners in Louisiana, in a parish adjacent to the one she lives in, I believe, were trying to ban books and giving the library board a hard time. And she went and gave a speech which basically said, you know, there's a process if you want to challenge a book because you don't think it should be in the library or you think it should be moved. There's a process for that, and it doesn't involve censorship. And she spoke out against censorship. And the mob of book banners who were at that library board meeting focused on her, and she became the target of real hatred in which she was called a groomer and a pedophile. They said all kinds of terrible things about her. They associated what she said at a public library board meeting with her work as a school librarian, and they essentially tried to ruin this woman's life. And so the book is in lots of ways a discussion about how she fought through the initial kind of despair and mental anguish that caused her, how she came out on the other side fighting, how that fight goes on. And it's also really an impassioned case for libraries and their importance in our community, and the importance of not allowing censors to go in and take books out of the library. This is one of those cases where when I was listening to the audiobook, I thought this is a perfect example of how we have lost our trust in experts. That we, as a society, we no longer accept that somebody who has spent their entire life studying something and doing this work, we assume, apparently lots of people in our society assume these people are up to no good and they cannot be trusted despite their expertise. And this is one of those cases. So if I could go on just a brief rant here about librarians and what this book kind of taught me or reemphasized to me is librarians are professionals. They work in libraries, school libraries, public libraries that have a system, that have a collection goal, that have you know, an ethos that drives their collection, and they spend time researching and studying what books to buy and where those books should be where those books should be shelved, and how those books are classified. In addition to kind of, you know, trying to read as many of those books as they possibly can themselves, and they're not out there putting pornography on the shelves of libraries where kids can get to them. One of the things that she points out, which I think is just an excellent point, and I've seen other people make it in their anti-library censorship videos here on YouTube, is the library is not a babysitter. You should not be dropping your under 13-year-old kids off in the library. That's not what they're there for. You should be, as a matter of fact, most libraries have a policy about not leaving unaccompanied children in the library, which, by the way, I just can't imagine in this day and age anybody thinking that was safe. And therefore, she rightly puts the responsibility for making sure that your kid doesn't see or read the wrong book on the parents of these younger children who should be there monitoring. She also points out the ridiculousness of these parents worrying about what books are on the shelf in a library and what their kid might see in a book like Gender Queer in just a few panels of illustration, when their kids are walking around with a pornography machine in their pocket that they can access unimaginable amounts of pornography on their phone. And these people are worried about with the books in the library. This is proof they're not really worried about the books in the library. This is proof this is about power and control and telling other people what they get to see and excluding people, particularly members of the LGBTQ plus community, by erasing them from public libraries. And I'm going to make one more statement and I'm going to stop. Members of the LGBTQ plus community are citizens of this country, and they have the right in public facilities, in taxpayer-funded facilities, to see themselves represented. They have the right to have books there that they want to read, that speak to them, that describe their experience. This is true for kids, and this is true for adults. And the librarians are there to make sure that those books are shelved and checked out to people who in age-appropriate groups, and they do that. Nobody is giving kids pornography in school libraries or public libraries. This is just not happening. And if you don't believe me, you know, open your public library's webpage, go to the catalog, and search for the names of books that you've seen banned. Search for genderqueer and see if you can see if your library has a copy, number one. If it does, see where it's shelved. If you don't believe the computer, go to the actual library and see where it's shelved. You know, these are things that could be solved in just a few moments if people had stopped listening to the right-wing nut jobs who are filling social media with lies about libraries and librarians and simply looked at the library themselves. Anyway, there you go. So as a book, I thought that Librarian was good. It's informative. It can be a little preachy. I have to say I feel like it's a little bit of there's some score settling going on in the pages of the book and maybe a touch of self-aggrandizement. That doesn't mean that I don't completely admire Amanda Jones and her book and everything she's done to fight for the freedom of everybody to read whatever they want to. Anyway, there you go. There is my wrap-up for the first few weeks of March. If you've read any of these books, have thoughts or questions about any of these books, please leave those in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching.